Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nick at Night. I'm so glad you're able to be with us, and I'm excited to share this topic with you. Well, and I'm also sure that you can probably guess what we're going to talk about tonight, but I don't want to spoil it for you just yet, because in these times, I mean, really, it has been just a weird couple of weeks, a weird 3 weeks. First of all, not being able to come together with each other on Wednesdays and Sundays or any other day that we would have decided to get together to go do something, serve community, or even just study our Bibles together. That is really, really strange. And I know everybody's feeling it right now. Everybody's like, this is so weird. We have to watch a couple of these guys preach online. And you know what? That's where we're at in this point of the world right now. But I want to encourage you to think bigger than that. I want to encourage you to look at maybe what some of the good things that will come out of this are, and how we'll see ourselves as a church, and how we'll see ourselves as a people who are trying to be the church and be a light in the community for those people. And sometimes our circumstances help shape our character. Our circumstances sometimes force us to be something that maybe we weren't before. Maybe it's this time of quarantine is going to make us study our Bibles a little harder, or pray a little different, or think about God a little more, or maybe even contact people that we've never thought we'd contact. You know what I've found weird over the last few weeks is it seems like every time I go into a store, that they've got another red X mark, lengthened out, or they've got, more people wearing masks. They've got all sorts of different things that, to be honest, it's just strange. The paranoia and anxiety that's coming with this virus, and I know there's a lot of people out there feeling it. I know that there's a lot of people who have immunocompromised diseases, and I know that there's people out there that are really struggling with this virus, and it's really hurting some people. And it's just been in my life, and I'm sure never in your life have you ever experienced anything like what we're experiencing today. What I've also been more encouraging is seeing families together. Seeing families together out doing things together. Like my family the other day. We got so sick of being inside, we said, you know what? We're going to get in the car and we're going to go for a drive. So we did. We drove out a little past Exeter, Rocky Hill, and then we got bored with Rocky Hill, so we drove a little further. Then we went way back in the back country, and we were trying to see how far we could get, and we figured out that this road we were driving on was going to lead us way back to the back part of Springville and into Porterville and all these other places. But to say the least, it was a really cool drive, because when we got to the top, this is what we saw. We saw that there was just these wide open spaces. Looks much different from the valley when you look up. I mean, you look up and it looks like it's almost vertical. But when you get up here and you look out across the valley, what a beautiful scene. The sun was setting. You could see almost all the way across to the other side of the valley. I mean, it was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. And even though we're not able to be around each other, even though we're not able to do the things we'd like to do, or be around the people we'd like to be around, or go to the events we'd like to go to, our circumstances are fantastic. You see, I think it's all about perspective, and the way that you see it, and the way that we see it, the way that we see that this virus is impacting the world can change how we respond to this virus. Now, the person I want to talk about a little bit tonight is the Apostle Paul, because the Apostle Paul, you know, and I know, on numerous occasions was put into prison. But the Apostle Paul doesn't step onto the pages of history as someone who's known for being particularly nice. He's not someone that steps on to the pages of history as someone who's known for being a character of virtue or a character of kindness. He's known for killing Christians and dragging them into court. In fact, he considered himself extremely zealous. We would probably consider Paul someone who was extremely zealous. But one day on his road to persecute Christians, he meets Jesus and he's converted. And then from there on, he's working for the cause of Christ. No longer persecuting Christians. Of course, people knew what he did before and people knew how he acted before. And so they didn't want to be associated with him. And so Paul is left in this condition where he's had to get out of Dodge for a little bit. But then he comes back and he gets into this church in Antioch and he gets with Barnabas and they go on a missionary journey together. And we get all of these different churches that are planted because of the Apostle Paul's 3 missionary journeys that we find in the book of Acts. One of which Paul writes about in the book of, or Luke records in the book of Acts, but Paul actually writes to in one of his epistles, and it's the Church of Philippi. Now, the Church of Philippi was founded around Acts chapter 16. Paul's being pushed out of these different cities. He comes into the town of Philippi, and he realizes that there's no synagogue, and so he goes to the river where these individuals would have met to worship God by the river, and he finds this woman named Lydia, and he converts her, and he stays in her house, and she's considered one of the brethren. Now, sometime after that, it seems like there's this problem that erupts in the church of Philippi. We can see that from chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. And Paul is addressing that particular problem. He's talking about the idea of selfishness and how selfishness is dividing them. But one of the ways that Paul illustrates selfishness or illustrates a way not to be selfish is by talking about his circumstances. But not only that, his unique perspective on his circumstances. Because let's face it, most human beings, we wouldn't be this positive about this situation. So take a look at what the Apostle Paul says in chapter 1 in verse 12. Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. Paul, of course, is talking about his imprisonment, and he'll say in the next verse that his imprisonment was part of this, but he's talking to the brethren. He says, I want you to know something. I want you to know that my circumstances, that my imprisonment has turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. He's saying, me being in prison has actually been good for the spread of the good news. And he's going to show them why in 2 ways. First, he's going to show them the people that he's reaching. So that my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else. Paul is simply telling them that by being imprisoned, I've been able to reach people that I wouldn't normally have been able to preach to. My imprisonment in the cause of Christ, my imprisonment in this nasty, horrible place has actually turned out for the good, that the guards, the people who guard the prison now know about the gospel, and everyone outside knows the gospel. Paul says, I've been reaching people from my circumstances. How are we reaching people in our current circumstances? How are we reaching out to people? How are people asking about faith? How are people feeling about faith? And how are people feeling about Jesus and God now that these things have kind of caused us to create some paranoia and anxiety in our world? And so reaching out to people, being in the circumstances that we are, can work out for the good. We're reaching people online that we probably have never reached before. Our video views are up 100%. They're phenomenal because people are wanting to be engaged in some type of religion in these times of circumstance. But secondly, Paul says something else that's encouraging. In Paul's imprisonment, he also wants us to point out something else about this particular thing. He says, and that most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord, right? So those who have faith in Jesus, because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. So, in other words, he's saying, now that I've been in prison and I'm not doing everything and I'm not preaching the gospel, and that now that I'm in prison for the cause of Christ, the brethren feel like they have some power. They feel like they have some courage to speak the word of God without fear. How much less fear in your life have you had since this pandemic? How much more courage have you had for speaking the word of God to the lost? maybe it's time to start thinking about doing that. Maybe it's time to start thinking about reaching out to people who don't have the gospel. Maybe it's time to start thinking about reaching out to your brethren and encouraging them. Paul's simply saying that most of the brethren are trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. What an encouraging time. Paul's circumstances, he says, this has turned out for the better progress of the gospel. The people of God have more courage. The more people in the Gentile, in the non-religious world have an understanding of the gospel. This is fantastic. And then he's going to switch gears. He says, but not only this, he says, there's more people preaching the gospel. He said, but some, to be sure, are preaching Christ from envy and strife. He said, some people preaching, some people speaking the word of God are not preaching it with the right motives. He says, but some also are preaching it with the right motives. Some also are preaching it with good will. Somebody, again, who has something against the Apostle Paul. For what reason? We can't be sure. Verse 16, the latter do it out of love. So notice these traits that he points out here. First of all, he says, that some preach it out of goodwill. Well, goodwill would fall right in line with love. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. On my behalf, they're doing it because they know they need to do it. They're not doing it to make me jealous. They're not doing it to make me envious. They're not doing it to create strife. They're simply doing it out of love for me, love for God, love for people. But also he says the former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, rather than from pure motives, thinking to cause me distress in my imprisonment. I think what Paul is pointing out here, he says, the two categories of people, one do it out of love, the others do it out of selfish ambition, rather than from pure motives, from goodwill, from love, which they should be doing it from, thinking to cause me distress. In other words, Paul's thinking, well, they just think it's going to cause me problems, it's going to make me jealous, it's going to make me stressed out. But Paul's saying, look, if the gospel is being preached, who cares? He says, one thing, only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is being proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. Paul says, you know what? My circumstances has caused me not to be able to do what I've normally done. Our circumstances in this world have caused us not to be able to do what we've normally done. But what is the benefit, the positivity that you've seen come out of what we've been doing over the last 3 weeks? How have our circumstances turned out for the greater progress of the gospel? Is our circumstances turning out for the better progress of the gospel? And when you think about this, the situation Paul's in, I mean, he's in prison. Not a prison like we know prison today, where it would be 3 meals a day and a fresh pair of clothes and, your own bunk bed with a bed. No, we're talking about, dirty, nasty circumstances that are not clean, that are not cleanly, that, Paul doesn't get bathed, and Paul doesn't get, all these different things that prisoners like us today. In fact, prisoners today are in a luxury situation compared to the prisoners of the first century. But Paul is in prison because of his preaching the gospel, and now he's encouraged other people to preach the gospel, and he's reached people outside of Christ. So he says, whether in truth or preaching, Christ is proclaimed, and I will rejoice. I want us to focus on this because even though Paul is in perspective, here 2 times he references joy. 2 times he encourages us to have joy. I rejoice, and yes, and I will rejoice. Why don't we have joy? Why don't we seek to strive for joy? Our circumstances dictate that we don't go outside. Our circumstances dictate that we don't be around people, and for good reason. But I also want to encourage us that this could also lead to something great. This could lead to something more than we think it could lead to. This could lead to more people being baptized. This could lead to more people coming to church. This could lead to more people digging in and diving into their faith. This could lead to more committed and convicted Christians for the cause of Jesus. And I hope that person is you. If you're here tonight and you have prayer requests and you have questions and you have thoughts that you want to be expressed, feel free to leave us a comment. Feel free to send us a private message and let us know what you're thinking. Let us know how we can pray for you. Let us know how we can encourage you. And we'll do our best to do that. It's going to be tough. Over the next couple of weeks, it's going to be tough. And we have to learn to look at our circumstances with positivity. I hope that you've learned something from this. I hope that you can take this with you on your journey. The lesson is yours. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to pray for the church and her leaders. Remember to mention by name each member of this congregation that you know, and keep them in prayer that they may be encouraged. Call, text, contact, FaceTime, whatever you got to do. Keep in contact with people. Don't isolate yourself completely. Isolate yourself socially, but don't isolate yourself completely. You can still follow the avenues that you need to contact and encourage other people. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great rest of your week.